Great talk to follow up all that good news, Mark. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, as Mark indicated, he gave a good news story for lake trout. Yesterday, most of the presentations were good news. And I think the message that we would like the Lake Huron community to hear is that all that good news doesn't relate well to the end user groups at this point in time, and a lot of changes may have to take place to try and accommodate that. We usually do at these meetings is present a report to the committee on harvest and yield of recreational commercial fisheries. There's been such a dramatic change over the last few years. The tech committee suggested that we should actually do it in a presentation format. So I'd like to thank the folks that helped me to put this together, Mark and G and Dave and Chris. It's a group effort to bring all this information together. Just a quick note that the date at this time is preliminary. There's still some of that information that does need to come in. We tried to gather up as much of the information as we possibly could. I don't see that any trends or any of the relationships that we're going to talk about are really going to change to any great degree. The majority of the information is in fact here, but I wanted to make note of that at this time. So to give you a sense of what does the commercial fishery look like in 2015, through the various agencies in the various parts of the lake, the core fishery is still dominated by whitefish and lake trout in terms of their harvest. A small yield of Chinook salmon, some walleye, some cisco are being caught, and a few other species. The Michigan commercial fishery is primarily whitefish. It's a trap net fishery. There's a small yield of, again, some other species like catfish and suckers, a little bit of yellow perch that is being commercially harvested. In Ontario waters, the commercial fishery is mostly whitefish, but there are smaller fisheries that involve lake trout, yellow perch, and some walleye that are being harvested. The recreational fishery, on the other hand, is a little bit different. In terms of Michigan waters, they have a fairly good database and do regular surveys throughout the lake. Suggests that in Saginaw Bay, a lot of the targeting or numbers of fish that are being harvested are mostly walleye, although still a large number of yellow perch that, in terms of numbers, are being taken out of Saginaw Bay. If you exclude Saginaw Bay and you look at the other port index sites, the majority of the fishing, recreational fishing, is actually taking lake trout today. Yellow perch and walleye follow through. Some smaller fisheries of coho salmon and rainbow trout, notably by its absence, although there still are some Chinook salmon, they didn't make the list. A very, very small part of the fishery in that water, which at one time was probably the dominant species. Unfortunately, there isn't a similar program in Ontario waters, so I can't provide a lot at this point in time. We're working up some information. There are some strong fisheries that do exist. They're fairly localized. There's localized fishing for walleye and perch, mostly walleye in the North Channel and a few locations in eastern Georgian Bay. There's a couple of good fisheries for yellow perch in the main basin, and then there are some good fisheries in specific tributaries for rainbow trout and a little bit of lake trout and Chinook salmon, again in just a couple of locations. So in terms of Lakewide harvest, this is all species, all agencies combined, and as Mark alluded to earlier, things have been declining for a number of years. The latest peak that we had was back in around 97 to 2000, and we're seeing a decline ever since. The line that's shown there is simply the current level, and if you look at the historic harvests in Lake Huron, there are very, very few years where we did worse than we did in 2015. 2015 was not a good year at all. We'll just take a closer look, and the rest of the slides will look just at the last 35 years to give you a sense of what has been happening. In terms of Lakewide yield in 2015, 2.3 million kilograms of fish were taken out of the lake. Again, the least that we've seen in this time frame. That's down from 2014. It's about 1/3 of what we actually took when it peaked back in 97. In terms of going back to the 1880s, the long-term data set is the 4th lowest yield on record. Most dramatic changes are occurring, as Mark alluded to, because it is predominantly a whitefish fishery. The most dramatic changes are occurring in northern Michigan waters and in Ontario waters in the main basin. No real major changes in terms of total exploitation out of the North Channel or Georgian Bay or Michigan water, the southern Michigan waters. In terms of commercial effort, the trap net fishery, which is primarily in the U.S. waters, although there's a little bit of trap net fishing that goes on in Ontario waters, fairly similar in terms of total number of net sets from 2014, but still we see that continuous decline from back in the 80s and 90s, and again, declining effort in the Cora fishery makes up the largest component of that decline. 83% of the trap netting is taking place in U.S. waters. In terms of large mesh gill nets, down slightly in 2015 from 2014, but again a declining trend over the last several years. It's still low relative to the 30-year record that we're presenting. It's the 3rd lowest effort on record. Up slightly in Cora waters, but down everywhere else. And the majority, again, of the large mesh gill net fishery is in Ontario waters. Small mesh gill net fishery is predominantly today a yellow perch fishery. Used to, at the earliest part of this time frame, a lot of that would have been targeting bloater and chub, but today it's primarily yellow perch. Extremely low relative to the 80s and 90s. Again, just because it's targeting a single species. 91% of this effort is in Ontario waters as well. In terms of the recreational yield, if we take the information, this is for Michigan waters, U.S. waters only. The biomass is down in 2015. It's approximately 30% of the total lake-wide yield of all fish comes out of this recreational fishery. And the key species here are walleye in the green, yellow perch in the dark or purple, and lake trout in the white. Again, a significant difference from the 1990s and 2000s when Chinook salmon in the blue there made up the majority of the recreational yield. Virtually gone in 2015. If we take a look at numbers, it's slightly different, but still a similar pattern. Approximately 38% of the average decline is actually due to the decline in yellow perch. Yellow perch is the black line simply because I had to put it on a different scale in terms of number of fish. They are an order of magnitude higher than anything else. But primarily, I guess the take-home message here is the key species that are being harvested are walleye in the green and lake trout in the white and yellow perch, all native species today. In terms of recreational effort, angler effort has been declining in U.S. waters over a long term, up slightly in the last couple of years, close to the 10-year average. Approximately 78% of this effort is actually coming from Saginaw Bay, a fairly focused fishery and focused on perch and walleye. I think Dave talked about the decline in fishing effort yesterday in walleye, primarily because there are so many and the catch rate is so high that you don't have to spend as much time going out and fishing anymore to catch your limit. And so that's an important feature. Part of that decline is, of course, because of the Chinook fishery that declined, and part of it is also due to declining yellow perch abundance in Saginaw Bay as well. So if we look at the commercial species on an individual basis, Mark gave us a rundown on what lake whitefish are doing, and this just reiterates what he talked about. We've seen a continuous slide in terms of harvest since that peak in 97 to 2000. We're down about, again, 65% since then. The last time that we had harvest that was this low was 1981. And most of the changes, again, for whitefish are occurring in the larger fisheries, in the Cora waters and in Ontario waters in the main basin. The Michigan harvest saw a slight, just the smallest change in 2015, and they've had an experimental fishery for whitefish last year that might have accounted for most of that. Excuse me. In terms of lake trout, actually lake trout harvest last year was up about 13%. Excuse me, from 2014. It's above the 20-year average. It's been fairly consistent over the last 10-15 years. It's up in all jurisdictions, although there were some smaller changes in the North Channel and Georgian Bay. Point to remember, again, this time series relative to the first time series I showed with the long-term trend is we're still an order of magnitude lower than historical harvests would have been pre-sea lamprey period in the 1910 to 1940 period. If we add the recreational component to this, excuse me, we don't see much of a change, although it's amazingly consistent since about 1985. Other than the short blip that we saw in 2003, 4, 5, there really hasn't been a lot of change in terms of total combined harvest of lake trout coming out of the lake. An interesting fact. In terms of walleye, the commercial yield is down about 20% from 2014. It's again very, very close to the lowest that we've seen on record. Actually, it's the third lowest that we've seen since 1973. And similar to lake trout, it's about an order of magnitude lower than historical harvest would have been in Lake Huron, but not a very high value or a very high amount of fish being taken out of the lake relative to the past. When we add the recreational fishery to this, a little bit of a different view, but still a fairly low amount of harvest. Thank you, Arunus. It was down about 28% from 2014. And the majority of the harvest is actually coming from the recreational component, in this case about 66%. And overall, it's just been variable over the last 10 to 20 years. In terms of yellow perch from the commercial fishery, a dramatic change in 2015. I'm really curious to try and explain why that's happened. We thought things were doing fairly well. The majority of that harvest was coming out of the southern Main Basin in Ontario waters, the gray striped area, and appeared to be building a population quite nicely, both in our independent data and just looking at the harvest information. And then to see a dramatic change like that is quite unusual. There has been a minor change in some of the other fisheries, really unchanged in Michigan waters in terms of commercial harvest. Cora for the last 2 to 3 years has seen a slight increase, but relative to what was happening in southern Main Basin, it's hard to even see on the graph. But this is, it's dropped down to about the 5th lowest yield on record in 1 year, which is fairly significant. When we add the combined yield of recreational and commercial, that drop still is there simply because the majority of the yield was coming out of the commercial fishery, even though recreational harvest was up about 30%. And about 17% of the total yield actually comes from the recreational fishery. So that commercial drop really defines this particular graph in a fairly low level. In terms of Cisco, some of the smaller harvests or species that have smaller harvests, virtually no change from 2014. A fair bit of variability over the last 20 years. Up in the North Main Basin, down in the south, and we saw some talks yesterday on Cisco and some of the projects that are planned. Still 2 orders of magnitude below historic harvest and historic yield, which is again significant. Just a few other species to give you a sense of what else is happening. There is a small catfish fishery, primarily in Michigan waters, has been declining fairly steadily for a long period of time, order of magnitude plus below the historical yield for catfish. Freshwater drum, not much of a change from 2014, but again well below a 20-year average, primarily again a Michigan fishery with a decline in Ontario waters. Bloater, we heard yesterday, is going through a period of recovery. However, they're not growing to a size that traditionally would have been fished by the commercial fishery. And so we see that fishery is essentially non-existent, petered out in the early 2000s, and we haven't seen anything since. Even though fishermen do tend to go out and experiment with some gear, they're not catching anything in any of the gear that they're fishing. Round whitefish, a bit of a surprise, a bit of an increase over the last several years, and up 31% from 2014. But again, relatively small numbers and small amounts relative to the large producers that we've seen in the past. Chinook salmon, which has been both commercially and recreationally harvested, is down in 2015 in the commercial aspect. It's down about 61%. It's the second lowest harvest since the harvest began at the beginning of the fishery back in the late 80s. And this is almost entirely a Cora fishery, the commercial component of it. If we add the recreational component, and unfortunately in the most recent years, really isn't a lot to add. It just shows that there's been a much stronger decline once you incorporate the recreational harvest that used to occur back in the 90s and early 2000s. That has now disappeared, and both of those fisheries, the recreational and commercial, are a very, very small component of the total yield coming out of the lake today. So back to this graph, I thought I would just take a couple seconds to point out a few issues or events that have occurred through time with the lake, and see how they line up with responses from the commercial fishery. There's no intent here to suggest cause and effect. It's simply to line things up and perhaps get some thoughts going out. But a lot of, again, like all of the Great Lakes, there have been a lot of issues and events that have occurred. We had the introductions that started back in 25 and in the 20s and 30s with alewife and rainbow smelt, the occurrence of sea lamprey, and we see after that we have a decline and we have also fairly strong exploitation occurring in that time, followed by a fairly strong decline. A couple of resurgences, but short term. We also see a switch from the number of species and the types of species that were being harvested. We had a fairly wide variety and a diverse number of species being harvested in the early period. Our latest resurgence was pretty much dominated by lake whitefish. But in recent years, again, we continue to have issues such as the dracenids, the round goby, bithotrephes, the collapse of alewife, and all of this lower trophic change that was occurring, and now we're seeing another response in the fishery. Oops, wrong way. So just to me, it appeared that there are a couple of different time frames here. In the beginning, we had all the introductions, essentially, a lot of them, and the response that we saw in the fishery. But more recently, we seem to be seeing more of a trophic level change. And Mark responded to the question about recruitment. I think his theory is bang on. Is that we have trophic level changes that are affecting what's available for larvae that are hatching, and the food base has changed so much that it's hard to imagine all of these fish finding spring food. Just on a different level, again, looking at the whitefish fishery here, again, no cause and effect, but simply to give you a timeline with some of the events that have happened through time. We had the building of this whitefish population at a time when we were actually planting lake trout, at a time that we had introductions happening. We were still getting fairly strong recruitment. And the peak of the recruitment was about 1989, 1990, so that during the time that we had these introductions, whitefish were still able to fulfill that recruitment, and that recruitment continued to build, of course. The peak in like I said, 89, 90, that's what fed the fishery up until about the 2000s. And then we have these ecosystem changes, these lower trophic level changes that are occurring, and we have the last of what we consider to be the strong recruitment, which has then led to the continued decline of that whitefish harvest. Again, no cause and effect, but just some food for thought, hopefully, in terms of what's happening in the lake and how the fishery actually reacts to it. So to summarize, the commercial harvest is probably the lowest commercial yield since 1973. As I mentioned, it's the fourth lowest on record. Extremely low effort as well. Whitefish still dominates the harvest, but unfortunately whitefish is our bad news story of the week, and it's not the good news story. Lake trout and walleye harvests are stable, and they're both good news stories, as we heard yesterday. Something did happen in 2015, either to the fishery or to the perch, and we need to investigate that a little closer. In terms of recreational, yield is down. It's the lowest since 1990. Effort is relatively unchanged in the last 5 years, and the recreational yield tends to make up about 30% of the total lake-wide yield, and that's up in recent years, primarily targeting species such as walleye, yellow perch, and lake trout, in that order. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.